and has been echoed in the positions that Ethiopia adopted throughout a decade of negotiations. For instance, Ethiopia refuses to sign a legally binding agreement. It has even objected to calling the instrument being negotiated an agreement, and has proposed to designate the text as merely guidelines and rules. Ethiopia has refused to include any form of binding dispute resolution provisions and insists on codifying an unlimited right to alter and amend the GERD agreement whenever it so desires. Ethiopia has sought to justify these unreasonable positions by invoking some mythical injustice that had been wrought upon it by so-called colonial treaties or by an unfair status quo. Nothing can be further from the truth. Ethiopia was never a colony and has never concluded a treaty relating to the Nile under the threat of coercion or compulsion. Moreover, Egypt has never objected to Ethiopia's right to harness the resources of the Blue Nile. However, Egypt expects and indeed demands that its upstream co-riparian complies with its international legal obligations, which require it to prevent the infliction of significant harm against the interests of its downstream neighbors. Ethiopia is also seeking to use the GERD negotiations as a backdoor through which to consecrate an unlimited and unregulated right to construct future projects along the Blue Nile, and has demanded that its co-riparians sign a hydrological blank check that grants it unrestricted control of the river. This was expressed in no uncertain terms in a letter dated January the 8th, 2021 from His Excellency Ethiopia's Minister of Water, in which he stated, and I quote, "Ethiopia does not have an obligation emanating from law or practice to acquire agreement from downstream countries to construct the GERD or any future water development projects," end of quote. This policy was put into practice when His Excellency the Prime Minister of Ethiopia announced on May the 30th, 2021, that his country plans to construct over 100 dams over the coming fiscal year without even the slightest mention of the interest or equities of its co-riparians, as if Ethiopia holds exclusive proprietary rights over the Nile and the other rivers that it shares with its neighbors, which was especially apparent in the damage inflicted by Ethiopia on Lake Turkana in Kenya. Mr. President, despite Ethiopia's persistent pattern of bad faith and in spite of its incessant unilateralism, Egypt continued to negotiate in good faith and with a genuine political will to reach an equitable agreement. For a whole decade, we explored every avenue and exhausted every opportunity to conclude a document that would enable Ethiopia to fill and operate the GERD while mitigating its harmful downstream impacts. An agreement that would become an instrument of regional integration and collaboration, and that would herald a new era of cooperation between our three countries. We sought an agreement through years of fruitless trilateral negotiations, during which Ethiopia effectively torpedoed our efforts to undertake joint studies on the socio-economic impacts of the GERD and to assess its environmental impacts. And as a result of Ethiopia's obstructionism, we now have no impartial scientific record of the adverse effects of this megadam. Egypt also accepted an invitation to participate in negotiations facilitated by the United States of America and the World Bank Group, and in which Ethiopia participated fully and freely, and that led to the drafting, after 12 rounds of intensive negotiations, of a comprehensive agreement on the filling and operation of the GERD, which Egypt signed, but which Ethiopia rejected. We also engaged in negotiations held upon the invitation from His Excellency the Prime Minister of Sudan, which, despite significant progress that was achieved, were ultimately undermined by Ethiopian intransigence. Moreover, for a whole year since the previous session convened by the Security Council on the question of the GERD, Egypt participated actively in the negotiations that were led by the African Union. We engaged in this AU-led process with a sense of optimism and faith. in the ability of our African brethren to facilitate the adoption of an agreement on the GERD. We work diligently to implement the instructions of the Bureau of the Assembly of the African Union at the summit level to reach a legally binding agreement on the filling and operation of the GERD. And we welcome the constructive engagement of our partners from the European Union and the United States in this process. However, after a year of faltering negotiations, and despite the highly appreciated good offices and untiring efforts of His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa and His Excellency President Felix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of the Congo during their respective periods as chair of the African Union, the AU-led process failed to yield the desired agreement. Our three countries were even unable to execute the simple task of compiling a complete text of a zero draft of the GERD agreement that provides a record of their negotiating positions. And countless weeks were exhausted in ineffectual virtual meetings and disagreements on peripheral matters of procedure. More troublingly, throughout this process, Ethiopia effectively derailed the AU-led negotiations. It repeatedly attempted to redirect the talks towards reaching non-binding arrangements for the filling of the GERD or for the appointment of focal points for the exchange of technical data. While these ideas may appear reasonable to the untrained eye, the reality is that these Ethiopian proposals contravene the instructions of the Bureau of the Assembly of the African Union at the summit level, which directed us to agree on the rules governing both the filling and operation of the GERD. More importantly, the practical effect of these Ethiopian proposals is to deny the downstream states any meaningful protection against the adverse effects of the GERD, and entitle Ethiopia to fill its reservoir and activate its massive turbines without instituting rules to mitigate the harmful impacts of this dam and regulate its operation, thereby posing a grave danger to our rights and interests. Furthermore, despite claiming to support the granting of an enhanced role to our partners who attended the AU-led negotiations as observers, the reality is that during the latest ministerial meeting held in Kinshasa on April the 4th to the 6th of 2021, upon the kind invitation from His Excellency President Felix Tshisekedi, Ethiopia rejected every proposal submitted by Sudan and Egypt to augment the AU-led process and expand the role of our partners in order to assist us in reaching an agreement on the GERD. As such, I find it deeply disheartening that I must report to the Security Council that the AU-led process in its current format has reached an impasse. A whole year of negotiations was expanded in fruitless talks, while Ethiopia continued the construction of the GERD and has now reached the point of continuing to unilaterally fill its reservoir. Mr. President, throughout these winding and arduous processes and at every juncture of the negotiations, Ethiopia remained implacable. It refused every proposal and rejected every idea presented by Egypt that would have guaranteed that Ethiopia would be able to generate hydropower from the GERD at optimal levels of efficiency while protecting downstream states against the potential harms of this dam. Ethiopia also blocked every compromise formula submitted to us by our international partners and continued to adopt inflexible positions designed to evade and elude any commitment to protect or even provide minimal safeguards to the interests of Egypt and Sudan. Even our efforts to engender confidence and build bridges of trust between our countries came to naught. We signed the 2015 Agreement on Declaration of Principles to affirm our commitment to reaching a fair and equitable agreement on the GERD. We presented a plan to establish a common infrastructure fund to broaden the horizons of cooperation between our countries. We proposed to contribute to the financing of the GERD to turn this dam into a symbol of friendship and brotherhood between our countries. and peoples. And we suggested to extend our power lines to help energize Ethiopia and assist its quest for development. And still, Ethiopia remained unyielding in its intransigence. As a result, the two downstream states are now left vulnerable to the evils of the GERD. We have no independently verifiable guarantees regarding the safety and structural stability of the GERD. And as such, 150 million Sudanese and Egyptians are condemned by Ethiopia to live under the harrowing specter of a towering structure that can hold up to 74 billion cubic meters of water without assurances regarding its safety or reliability. Nor do we have any protection against the incalculable damage that the GERD can inflict during future periods of drought. At a time when the river grows dry and the land gets parched under the searing sun and the livelihoods of Egyptians is imperiled, Ethiopia is unwilling to release the waters of the Blue Nile to quench the thirst of the downstream valley. Indeed, that is the crux of the problem. All that Egypt has called for and sought is a binding agreement that includes an insurance policy against the harmful impacts of the GERD on Egypt's water security by designing a mechanism through which our three countries could cooperate to collectively bear the burden of addressing future periods of droughts. Unfortunately, however, Ethiopia remains steadfast in its rejection of any form of agreement that provides any meaningful measure of protection to the interests of downstream states. And so, Mr. President, it is not an overstatement to affirm that for Egypt, the GERD is an existential threat. Our estimates and scientific models indicate that this megadam can wreak incalculable damage on Egypt, despite the precautionary measures that we have taken in anticipation of Ethiopia's unilateral filling of the GERD and our tireless efforts at conservation and water reuse. For us, the harm that the GERD might inflict will affect every aspect of the lives of the Egyptian people like a malignant plague. In the absence of an agreement that regulates its filling and operation, the GERD can cause cumulative water shortages in Egypt amounting to 120 billion cubic meters. It will diminish access to clean drinking water. It could deprive millions of farmers of the water they use to irrigate their fields. It will rob countless families of their income and livelihood. It will destroy thousands of acres of arable land. It will increase desertification and degrade the riparian ecosystem. And it will increase vulnerability to the effects of climate change. This is a situation that Egypt cannot and will not tolerate. It is therefore imperative that for the international